The need to communicate and collaborate on a global level has created a proliferation of cloud-based tools for businesses. But with new channels come new gaps for hackers and many new security blind spots. You need full threat visibility across channels with a solution that works at the speed your company does. Perception Point's multi-layered platform provides the most robust threat prevention on the market. Perception Point advanced collaboration security designs for the modern enterprise. Visit securityweekly.com/perception point. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. Join myself and Rich Mogul on none other than May the 4th to learn how to choose the right architecture for your application. Live attendees of this webcast will have a chance to win a $100 Hacker Warehouse gift card. Register for this webcast at securityweekly.com/webcasts. And don't forget to check out the on-demand library at securityweekly.com/on-demand. This interview is with Marcus Sachs, the Deputy Director for Research at the McCrary Institute for Cyber and Critical Infrastructure Security. He also serves as the Chief Security Officer of the Pattern Computer, is a retired U.S. Army officer, and was a White House appointee in the George W. Bush administration. His private sector experience includes serving as the Deputy Director of SRI's International Computer Science Laboratory, as the Vice President for National Security Policy at Verizon Communications, and is the master of long titles. Marcus, welcome to the show. I should also say you're the Director of the SANS Internet Storm Center as well.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. I'm now the Director Emeritus. Yeah, I turned that over to Johannes, 10 or 12 years ago. And he's done a fantastic job of actually running the Storm Center. But that was something that it's been around since the Y2K era. So it's one of the oldest groups that's still alive, still doing good things, still serving the mission as it's been doing.
It's awesome. I know, Marcus, I know you've been on the show in the past, but I want to refresh it for our audience. How did you get started in information security?
Well, like many of us, we've got backgrounds that have nothing to do with what we currently do. So I was in the Army, came in as a second lieutenant, ROTC kind of thing, with an undergrad degree in civil engineering, and went right into the Corps of Engineers. But I've always had a hobby interest in ham radio, computers, and I've had a ham radio ticket since I was 13 or 14 years old. We're talking early 70s. So in the Army, everything is all done formally. And back in the 80s, if you were a hacker, nobody knew who you were. But there was a growing number of us who could fix things. We didn't really call ourselves hackers, but something was broken that had to do with a computer or a computer connection. We pretty much knew how to fix it. After a while, Uncle Sam figures out what you're really good at. And by the early 90s, I wound up getting assigned to Fort Bragg, to 18th Airborne Corps, and became the 18th Airborne Corps, what we called automation officer. That's kind of an old term, which today would be like a CTO or a CIO. But that was right after the first Gulf War, so we're talking early 90s. And in those days, we could do whatever we wanted to. There really were no rules yet. Everything the Defense Department was doing in terms of offense and defense was locked up behind many doors at the NSA. And the rest of the world really just didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't know what we were doing. So we were free to do whatever we wanted to do. And we began to figure out, we being a bunch of us in the Army and in the Navy, Air Force, others, that computer networks needed to be maintained. We had packet switching, we had routing, if you remember old Banyan Vines.
Yes. Oh, man.
Novell networks and all that kind of stuff. And we had to make it all work together. So we literally were hacking these networks and hacking devices and getting them to work. The term security in those days, if you said to somebody that you were a security professional, they really thought you were a guard at Walmart or doing the night beat around somebody's fence. So this concept that we have today, where everybody wants to be in security, 20, 30 years ago, that was not a career field that people really just wanted to get into. So at some point, you sort of realize this is your passion, this is what you're doing. And Uncle Sam figured out that I was one of the few people that could not only break things, but could fix things and could keep the bad guys out. So I wound up moving to Washington, D.C. in 1998 as part of a brand new joint task force for computer network defense. Now, this was the first time the Defense Department had actually created an organization deliberately to understand the threat and to defend the Defense Department's networks against those kind of threats. We had computer emergency response teams, CERT teams, and we did have, as I mentioned with NSA, this behind the green door capability that nobody knew about, but to actually create an out in the open defense unit was a new thing. And we quickly said, we can do this defense all day long, but defenders don't win wars. You got to go on the offense at some point. Same thing with, sports and football. You can't just play defense. You have to go on offense. And eventually we added offense to what we were doing. And the lawyers got a little squirrely on that, and back and forth it went. And ultimately, about 10 years later, the DoD created Cyber Command. The history since then.
Right. Now, where were you for, speaking of this football analogy, there was Operation Eligible Receiver. That was before. Where were you during that time?
Yeah, so Eligible Receiver happened when I was at Fort Hood, Texas. Mm-hmm. So I moved from Bragg to Hood. So I was the Corps, 18th Airborne Corps Automation Officer at Bragg.
And then Bragg is North Carolina?
That's correct. Yep. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And in the mid-90s, the Defense Department, the Army in particular, were looking at the future battlefields and what would computers and computer networks bring to us. So in the Army, we had a thing called Force 21, or digitization of the battlefield. And they chose Fort Hood, and specifically 4th Infantry Division, to be the test division to see, with the question being, what would happen if we put all these computers and things all over the tanks and Apache helicopters and inside the infantryman's backpack? Well, we were running these experiments at Fort Hood when Eligible Receiver. Mm-hmm. And that, in case the readers don't know, that's an exercise, an annual exercise, highly classified. And in 1997, the point of the exercise was to see if fictitious North Korean hackers could break into the real Pacific Command, or PACOM, out in Hawaii. So it was all scripted. It's run by NSA, top secret classified type of thing. And as you can imagine, NSA had trouble getting in. But they left all the clues. They came in through AOL, mm-hmm. Earthlink, if you remember all those dial-up ISPs from the late 90s.
Yeah, I heard the story, Marcus, that it wasn't the NSA's A team, as it were. It was the B team that was.
Yeah, that's very likely.
So you're okay.
Likely excuse.
To be fair, the system administrators in those days were not expecting to be attacked. They were more looking for, how do you make Microsoft work. With Apple?
Yep.
How do you integrate these other things? And attacks just were not really. I mean, there was malware, of course. We had viruses and things along those lines. We were beginning to deal with. Antivirus software was starting to come of age. But to think in terms of a nation attacking somebody, well, Eligible Receiver, 1997, proved it could be done. I was again at Fort Hood at the time. I heard about it through the grapevine, but it was highly classified, so we didn't get all the details, but we knew that somebody had conducted an exercise out in Hawaii, and it was very successful. But the rest of the story, of course, this was all briefed up at the Pentagon, mm-hmm. and there were lots of non-believers. Of course, this is NSA. NSA can break into anything they want to. We would be disappointed if they had not done what they did. Well, in February of 98, so just literally months later, the United States Air Force came under an attack. And this was about the time that, if you remember, between the two Gulf Wars, we had a no-fly zone to the north of Iraq and a no-fly zone to the south of Iraq. And we told Saddam Hussein, as long as you stay between those two no-fly zones, those lines on the ground, you can fly around. But if you go above it or below it, we're going to shoot you out of the sky. Well, the Air Force, which of course is conducting all these operations, come under an attack, and all the clues, all the forensics point back to Baghdad. And you get this kind of, oh my gosh, everything we talked about during Eligible Receiver last year, which was just an exercise, is now actually happening. Only it's not the North Koreans, it's the Iraqis. And it's not Pacific Command, it's the entire Air Force, and they're attacking us. And you can imagine the panic, that's unfolding up inside the Pentagon. Well, as investigations unfolded over the next several days, believe it or not, it turns out it's two teenagers in California mm-hmm. that are doing all this, and they're acting like Iraqis. And we came very, very close, very close to going physical over this thing against Baghdad, when it turns out it's not Baghdad at all. Now, this was a great awakening, because we're two teenagers are showing the Defense Department that it really, that cartoon, you remember this thing from a long time ago about nobody knows you're a dog on the internet?
Yep. Right.
And nobody knows you're a teenager. They think you're an Iraqi. This was really eye-opening. And I get a phone call spring of 98. It says, hey, we need you to come up here to Washington. And we're putting together this joint task force. And again, I'd heard a little bit about it through the grapevine. So I flew up to Washington and they said, you interested? And I said, of course. So my wife was not interested. She liked it down in Texas, didn't want to live in Washington. But well, we moved there anyway. And we stayed there for 22 years before we finally left a couple of years ago. So it was a time almost like barnstorming for the aviators, like after World War I, but before World War II started. That time, late 90s, early 2000s, we really were kind of making things up. We literally were barnstorming. If you needed a runway in those days, you'd find a cow pasture. And in our case, if you needed a hacker, you needed somebody with skills, you'd go to DEF CON, see what you could hire.
Right,
It was a strange time. And in fact, we even began to establish good, strong relationships between this joint task force and the hacking community. Many people who are probably watching this episode can remember 20 plus years ago out at DEF CON and Black Hat and many other cons where those of us in DoD were working with them, trading information. It was building partnerships because we knew that the threats were common, and here in America, we're trying to defend the same stuff. So it was a neat little band of brothers that emerged back in those days. It's all been formalized now under Cyber Command.
Right?
So,
yeah.
So it's not as kind of free for all as it was 20 years ago, and it's probably good that it's matured. But there was that brief window there where things were very much like barnstorming the old airplanes. And in a way, I kind of wish it was like that for the youngsters because we didn't have the constraints or the rules to operate under. We were freely able to do things. Today, there's a lot of boundaries, a lot of guardrails in place to make sure that the young ones in the Defense Department don't break anything. And so I think part of that spirit is gone, and maybe we need to recapture a bit of that and make some more room for the young minds that are coming in to be more free, more able to do things. So
I agree, Marcus. I was talking with someone earlier, and they were describing in the 80s and earlier 90s than the time frame you were describing, right? It was really like exploration. You'd get into a system, you'd find a system, see what you can do with it. If it was missing patches, you'd go ahead and patch it for them, right? He likened it to walking my dog and I'm picking up the dog poop and I find some trash, so I pick that up too, right? Because you're a good citizen.
Yeah, it's like security as a service.
And now it's really difficult to do that in a public setting, right? Now we think of it in terms of labs and things like that, which we should encourage, but different times, Well, Marcus, what did you do in the George W. Bush administration?
Well, it's kind of a continuation of the story. So at the Joint Task Force, we were beginning to put together rules of the road, what we're supposed to do, how we interact with foreign cyber adversaries, identifying them. And we had identified, or the intelligence community had identified Osama bin Laden as a terrorist, Al-Qaeda as a terrorist group. So we knew all about that. We knew about the different Chinese groups, Russian groups, and others. But for many of us, Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden were physical terrorists. There really was no connection to cyberspace. But what we were seeing through the 90s was, this growth of cyber threats. And everybody thought, if you would have asked us on the morning of September 11th, 2001, prior to 9 a.m. Eastern time, what would be the next attack on America? Well, they probably would say, it'd be the cyber Pearl Harbor. It'd be an attack against the power grid, attack against the water systems, or against banking and finance. So 10 minutes later, when the first airplane hits the first tower, and then a few minutes after that, the second airplane hits the second tower, many people in cyberland were wondering, okay, I thought the next attack was going to be cyber, but here they come again doing it physical. And it really caught a lot of us off guard because we literally thought it was going to be a cyber attack and not physical. Well, as the days went by, we come to find out there actually was quite a large cyber connection here. We found that terrorist groups had been gaining access to systems. They'd been using it for reconnaissance, for intelligence gathering. money laundering, making money to finance these operations. And at the White House, there was still a lot of concern of a second attack. History-wise, if you look at this thing happened in September of 2001, and January, February of 2002, there was the Salt Lake City Olympics coming up, and a big fear that there would be a cyber or physical attack impacting the Olympics, kind of like a phase 2 of what happened on September 11th.
But many at that time, Marcus, thought that the anthrax scare was phase 2.
Anthrax was also part of it as well. You're absolutely right. So at the time of that terrorist event happening, I was at the end of my 20-year career. I'd already announced my retirement, was out, had been interviewing with various contractors and companies and so forth, and found a couple of them I'd really like to work with the plan of retiring at the end of the year and early 2002, go off to industry. So I got a phone call from the White House, maybe last week of September, first week of October. Hey, we hear you're retiring. How'd you like to come work for us?
Mm-hmm. It's not how this works.
How do you know I'm retiring? Well, we're the White House. We know these things. Mm-hmm. Touche. Yeah, you should know these things. I'm disappointed that you didn't. Yeah. So, then it was, okay, do I go off to industry? Do I go off to the White House? So, you kind of think about it, because the White House, it's a 7-day-a-week job, 24/7. There's really no rest while you're there. And it's not something you take lightly. So you really have to, deeply think about it. But all my friends were, and of course my family, just say you can't say no to something like that. So I literally retired on a Friday, had Saturday and Sunday off, signed in on Monday at the White House. And for those who work there, you probably know what I'm talking about, particularly if you had a short appointment and you're not political. It's almost like Cinderella. One day you walk into this beautiful castle and everything, and then the next day you're back into outside the door. It all just goes by so fast, right? But I was part of the National Security Council, and we're creating teams there to understand all the different types of threats. So cyber was one of them, chemical, anthrax, all the different biology, things like that. And when I started working there had been rumors of creating a Department of Homeland Security, a DHS. Mm-hmm. But politically, it wasn't something that either party really wanted to do, because it'd been enlarging government. But after a while, it became necessary that we had to do that. So by the summer of 2002, the decision had been made, we will create this new department called DHS. And all of these special staffs that were put together in the wake of September 11th got laser focused on, okay, how do we build this thing? What are the different parts? So our group and this cyber group, which was maybe 10 of us, 10 or 12 of us or so. Dick Clark.
I was going to say Dick Clark was there at that time, right?
Yep, he was the special assistant to the president for cyber things, and we began working on a plan, a national strategy to secure cyberspace was the name of the plan. And then Homeland Security was then the cyber piece of it would then execute that plan. So this all came together by the beginning of 2003. So roughly a year after we had stood everything up, we began announcing what all these strategies and plans would look like. Homeland Security opened their doors, I want to say March or so of 2003. And we began shutting down those operations in the White House and moving them over to Homeland. So most of us either went back to where you came from if you were from another agency, maybe you're from the Defense Department or from the State Department. There are a few of us like me who I retired from DOD and then I became an appointee to the White House, not doing duty there, as an assignment. And so I'm thinking about, okay, if we're done here, it's time to head back to industry or, pick up where I left off type of thing. And they said, no, we need some folks to help us get DHS started. So, okay, fine. I'm still in the government, may as well stay there. And so 3 of us literally stood up what today has become CISA. So many years later, this multi-thousand person at CISA began with 3 of us in May of 2003.
Now, who are the other folks, Marcus, out of curiosity?
Yeah, I figured you would ask that.
Well, you mentioned these 2 other people, and I'm like, wait, who are they? Do we know their names?
Yeah, gosh, yeah. You know what senior moments are, right? I'll think of it as soon as we hang up the
I asked Marcus because your recollection of all these details and everything is astonishing. By the way, I'm really blown away. We're talking the almost 20 years, roughly 20 years ago. So.
It's been a while. Well, I mean, it's so one of the things we've learned in cyber is we suck at keeping track of things when it comes to the history books.
Yeah, agree.
Those who do not remember their history are doomed to repeat it. Yes, well said, sir.
Yeah, and when we created the JTF, for example, we began, people who were new to it were repeating things. And we had a number of folks from the 70s and 80s that came in and visited us and said, hey, we did this on a mainframe, or we did this on an early, ARPANET network or an X25 network. And you guys are not inventing anything new. We've already been down this road. In fact, do you remember the book called The Cuckoos Egg?
Oh, very well.
Late 80s?
Cliff Stoll.
Yeah. So, Cliff Stoll's book. So we made that required reading for everybody in the JTF. Read The Cuckoos Egg, which at that point was pushing 12 years old or so. And it could have been written the day earlier. I mean, the things we were seeing in the late 90s were exactly as what they had seen in the late 80s. So very little had changed. The technology has changed, but the attacks and stuff were more or less the same. So
yeah, and I mean that turned out to be espionage, really.
Yeah.
I mean,
it was the Chaos Computer Club, the CCC.
Yeah, they were affiliated with the There's another great book that now I'm having a senior moment, and I told Larry about that tells the other side of the story around Pengo and the other hackers that were on the other side of Clifford Stoll.
Right.
And it was I didn't realize there was that component to the story. And I think if you read collectively those works, you'll kind of get the full picture. To your point, Marcus, like not much has changed. Like those are still lessons we need to learn and stories we need to read about.
You know Jay Healy, right? I'm sure you've talked to him before.
I don't know if we have on the show, but I know
you might want to interview him. So Jay's actually written a book. Now it's Air Force centric. He was an Air Force officer. So he kind of looking over his shoulder was saying, we've spent a lot of time capturing the early history of aviation, particularly, Air Force style aviation and naval aviation and so forth. And we teach young aviators, here's the history. When you go to flight school, starting off with the Wright brothers, even before them with balloons. So everybody knows the history of military aviation, but the history of military cyber, virtually unresearched. So he wrote a book about it a number of years ago just to start that process. And I think that's an area we do not do well. And a lot of people coming into this career field today think that it all started maybe with the iPhone.
Right. Well, even several years ago, I remember someone critiquing SANS going, I sat in a SANS class and we learned about all this old stuff. And I'm like, no. Like I don't agree with that critique at all, because learning that old stuff has provided such a foundation. And I took a lot of that SANS training, number of years ago. I was like, those are really fantastic lessons to learn from.
If the old stuff still works, is it really old?
It's true. But and it was funny, a lot of pen testers will tell you today, hey, I pulled a payload from a Metasploit version that's 10, 15 years old. I don't know. Metasploit, I think, goes back that far, and it works today.
It's really close to being that old, because it came out right when we started the podcast.
Yeah.
And
as of a couple of years ago, as of a couple of years ago, H.D. Moore claimed that the original version of Metasploit, if you can actually find it, there's 11 exploits in it. And the 11th exploit works on a bank, and it still worked up until when he gave the talk that I watched, which was probably Oh, never mind. Okay, it's several years ago, but 2007.
Darknet Diaries, episode 114 with H.D. Moore for a little walk down memory lane.
There we go.
It's a great episode.
Not that you don't remember everything yourself. With
right. I remember because H.D. was just on a podcast I listened to last week.
Yep, exactly. Well, if you could find some of Kevin Mitnick's exploits, that he did, some of those things probably work just fine. I mean, there's a lot of this. What we think is old school hacking, to your point, I would be trying that. If I was a pen tester, I'd be running through those old tools first before I start this, new super elite kind of things, because you're likely to get in. And it's, that's unfortunate, because again, we're not teaching our defenders a lot of those basics, turning off unneeded services, things along, things that we all just take for granted that, the new people coming into this career field just don't understand. And by the way, we can maybe segue into that a little bit later. We're horrible when it comes to attracting people to this career field.
Yeah,
there are so many openings and growing year by year, and so few people that want to get into it. And
speaking of which, that brings me back to CISA. And you served under the George W. Bush administration. DHS was formed. I remember that very vividly. But there was a division of Homeland Security that became what CISA is today. Marcus, how did that happen?
Yeah. So, and by the way, Jerry Dixon was one of the three of us. I just remember, and I know Jerry so well. I don't know why I couldn't come up with this name.
Okay. I put you on the spot there. It's all right.
Yeah, I'll think of the other one in just a minute. But yeah, when this began, there was a part of Homeland Security, as you probably know, has a lot of uniformed groups. That's the Secret Service, the Coast Guard, TSA, Borders. Those are all uniformed. There's also non-uniformed, like the research people. That there used to be, or today CISA, but there used to be a group called IAIP, Infrastructure Analysis, Information Analysis and Infrastructure Protection.
Yep.
IAIP had its own undersecretary, and buried inside of there on the IP side was where you found cyber. But it's also where you found all the other infrastructures that DHS was worried about. Those IAIP eventually went away, created, there's been several groups that have come along, but ultimately CISA, which I believe is 3 years old now, is a full agency, just like TSA or just like FEMA and others. It's on that same par.
Yeah,
but
I was corrected. I was corrected in saying that in the Trump administration, CISA was created. Some people it wasn't created; it was more formalized in that. That's administration.
Correct. I mean, the term Congress is the one that created it, if you want to call it that. Put it into congressional language, made it a law, and gave it funding. Prior to that point, the functions were all there, and certainly, the building where they all operate out of in the Northern Virginia Metro DC area, all that was there. The same people, but there had long been talk about. They needed to have agency status instead of just being one of the staffs of DHS. And that they finally got the right people in Congress to agree to that. And that President Trump signed into law. So that way you could say it was created under Trump, but the ideas certainly predate, go back to Obama and before. So it's not, it wasn't new in terms of an idea, but it's definitely, that's when it stood up. It was during the Trump administration. Yeah. And now it's fully funded, and they're programmatically they're growing. They've got new ideas. They're not uniformed. I don't think we'll ever see them wearing uniforms, nor do we want them to. But they need the outreach. They're building. They're trying to put people across the states and major cities and counties. So
yeah, Marcus, and I didn't know this till like last month when I met the CISA representative for Rhode Island, and I was like, wait, what do you mean we have a CISA? He's like, Paul, every state has a CISA representative, like a liaison almost. I'm like, I didn't know that. I'm like, that's awesome.
Yeah. And that again shows their maturity.
Yeah.
That it's not just a DC thing, or it's not, just for the high level companies, the big, Fortune 500s, but it is something we need to get out. As we talked about a little while ago, I don't live in DC anymore. We moved 2 years ago down to Alabama. And here in Alabama, like in most rural focused or farming focused states, they have extension services, and the extension services are similar. These are in all the little cities and counties, and they're there to help the agricultural community, the farmers and growers and stuff. If they need to know about fertilizer, they need to know about different types of crops, soil conditions, all government funded, this outreach to the agricultural community. Well, that same mindset can certainly be there in cyber. There's no reason why we can't extend this out across America. It doesn't have to be just in Washington. And I think that's a really cool model. We do it, with other sectors of the economy. So why not do it with cyber?
A cyber extension service to offer to the small business, the farmer of the business world, the small business.
Wouldn't that be something, right? And then extend that, if you like, the farming model. You've probably heard of 4-H, the youth group where they teach them.
And Future Farmers of America. I grew up on a farm.
FFF or FFA, as well as 4-H. I mean, we ought to be thinking the same way with cyber. Can we set up something similar in middle schools and high schools that are designed to start getting kids interested? I mean, we do have Cyber Core, and we've got some other things that are getting going, but a more formal along the lines of like scouting groups or 4-H or Future Farmers. And I think that would really kind of raise the bar a little bit and get more people interested in the career field. because as I mentioned earlier, we have a huge shortfall now, and it's only getting worse.
So, Marcus, I'm going to invite you. Oh, I'm sorry, Marcus, I'm going to invite you. I'm one of the organizers of B-Sides Delaware and B-Sides DC. And we actually have Spawn Camp and Crypt Kids, respectively, for the conferences. We name them different things, but we have a lot of the same events. We let the kids take computers apart and overhead projectors and everything else, so they learn with their hands. And we give them children wireless challenges. We actually have a Fox and Hound game with the kids. It's awesome with RTL SDRs. And we do kids crypto challenges and escape rooms and things like that between the two conferences. So we're trying.
Well, since you mentioned that, and the question earlier was how did I get into this? My grandfather in the late 60s, I want to say maybe 67, 68, when I was still a one-digit kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old, he handed me his old pocket watch, which was broken. And the challenge was, can you take it apart and tell me what makes it tick? Now, imagine doing that to a 7-year-old. Mm-hmm. Well, first off, imagine finding a pocket watch that ticks and hand it to a 7-year-old and say, take it apart and tell me how it ticks. Well, do that in the cyber world. Here's an iPhone that doesn't work anymore. Take it apart and tell me how this thing actually works. You want to stimulate these little minds, get them curious. I think that's a big piece, is the curiosity factor. So you don't have to be a super duper programmer, really good with a soldering iron and whatnot. But if you're curious and you're naturally curious, this is a great field to get into. And I also should say the other group that's missing is law enforcement. Kids that come into this career field and want to work for the government generally go to the DOD, DHS, things like that. Very few go to the FBI or Secret Service or even to local law enforcement, police and sheriff's departments. They need smart brains who can do digital forensics, who can examine crime scenes, and they know what evidence to pick up, digital evidence, and use that for prosecution. So, this is kind of an appeal to any parents who might be watching this. If you've got a bright, young, curious child, push them into this field. They don't have to be, nerdy computer programmers. There's lots of room for people who are curious and want to learn and kind of have that aptitude. We really, really, really need more coming in. I'm just afraid we're creating this highly complex environment that people just don't understand, and our adversaries can take advantage of it. And that's one of the best things we can be doing for all of us, is just trying to attract more people into the career field.
Yeah.
Well, I'm an ex-cop, and I'll tell you that when I was a cop back in 2002, 2005, somewhere in there, it was horrible. Because the digital forensics field was, if you're not an ex-cop, ex-FBI, you can't do digital forensics. I'm like, I teach it. Yeah. And they brought me to the crime lab. They asked me, I'm an active duty officer at that moment, right? They bring me into the crime lab. They're like, all right, show us digital forensics. I'm like, all right. So I look at their machine. I'm like, you've got autopsy configured wrong. And like, we don't use autopsy. We use NCASE. I'm like, well, that's your first problem. And they're like, but NCASE is the best. I'm like, it is very good at certain things, but at the time it was NCASE 3 or NCASE 4. I'm like, but there are certain things that autopsy and sleuthkit is better at. And volatility was just coming out, and so I was showing them that, and they were blown away. And then they're like, all right, so we want you to work over here. Okay. What's the deal? I'm like, well, you give up your gun, you give up your badge, your pay goes down. And and you can't take any details to make extra money. Like, I'm going to pass.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, having those right incentive, having those right incentive programs and pushing people down the right paths is key in all these areas. Right. And it has gotten better. I was listening to last week's episode, where Captain Alfred was talking about, how do you come to be the technical forensics expert in the police department? Like, I knew how to load paper in the printer, so therefore I was the forensics expert, right?
Yeah, I fixed the boss's computer, did a Control-Alt-Delete, it started working, so now I'm the
expert.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Marcus, I did want to ask you about some of the collection of crypto mechanical cipher equipment. I read the book Code Girls, Love that book. That book was amazing. Very eye-opening to when we talk about mechanical, manual cipher and crypto systems. Was very eye-opening, even to just that aspect and many others. Just perspectives in the war, and all of that stuff was just amazing. And it kind of got me nerding out a little. Like, what was available at the time? I'm assuming you've read that book.
Yeah, not only read it, but met the lady who wrote it. She's a fascinating lady as well. So
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, there was, we're just restarting it, but pre-COVID, NSA would have every other year symposium up near Fort Meade. And the last one we did before COVID started, the author showed up and was, pitching her book because it was brand new. So it was kind of fun. She gave a good talk on it. All the ladies she interviewed,
amazing.
Obviously, are still around, and she was struggling to do interviews before the code girls all died. That's a big problem because people were, in their 90s. She had a few of them she'd interviewed that are already into their hundreds, and family members that could do recollections for those who were long gone. But she said it was one heck of a project. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier with capturing the history.
Right.
You can let Hollywood do it. If you look at the movie. About Alan Turing.
Imitation Game, yeah.
Imitation Games, right? Which has inspired a lot of people, but it's not exactly historically accurate, but it makes a good Hollywood movie.
It does. And, I remember my in-laws going, "Oh, it was this great movie we watched, and it was the guy that did the code break." I'm like, "Oh, the Imitation Game, Alan Turing." They're like, "Yeah, how did you know that?" It's part of our history in technology and security. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, but I'm not knocking the movie. Everybody should watch it.
Agreed.
But if you want a really cool one, read Cryptonomicon.
Yes.
If you want to get turned on about encryption and the Enigma and Alan Turing and all that, that's the book to read.
And amazing tie-ins. We watch one of those adventure recovery shows with Josh. I can't remember. Mind blanks.
Are you having a senior moment too?
Yeah, absolutely. And the episode that was recorded on the DVR was about the Japanese gold that had been hidden in the Philippines, which was tied right into the Cryptonomicon stuff. And I'm like, I want to watch that one.
Yeah. Oh, that book, it's hard to read. It's a hard book to read, but it is definitely something everybody in this field should be reading because and granted, it's fiction, but they've got a lot of historically accurate threads that run through it, which is really cool. But let's go back to what you wanted to talk about with, collecting mechanical devices. So we all have hobbies and interests, and it's kind of fun when your passion, security intersects with a really cool hobby. So mechanical cipher devices, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Enigma Machine. That's, the kind of like the ultimate encryption device. But there are many others. So the brief history of this is that mechanical encryption has its roots back to the Romans, Greeks, and before, with little wheels and devices and dials you can spin. So that the idea of using mechanical things to help encrypt is not novel. What changed, though, was post-Civil War. You had telegraphs, of course, during the Civil War, so messages would only move as fast as a telegraph operator could type them out. So if you wanted to encrypt something, you could take your time encrypting it because it would probably take longer to transmit it by telegraph than it would take to encrypt it. But as radio began to come of age and telephone starts to come of age a few decades after the Civil War, there was a recognition that we needed to make the speeds go faster. The electric typewriter was introduced in the 1880s, 1890s timeframe, which was a pretty big breakthrough in order to, or actually just the regular typewriter was a big breakthrough. And so in the early 1900s, say about the end of World War I or so, there were some inventions that all happened about the same time that took the concept of a typewriter, a mechanical typewriter, and the need for creating encryption faster, with the idea being, can I just type out my message using a typewriter, but instead of the text that's coming off on the paper being what I typed in, could it come out as ciphertext, crypted text? It's an easy question. The answer is obviously is yes. And so one of the first machines introduced around 1919 or so was called the Enigma Machine. Enigma being, a word that means puzzle or something difficult to understand. It was not introduced as a wartime machine. This was after World War I. And in fact, in the 1920s, thousands of these machines were sold to businesses here in the United States and elsewhere as business encryption devices. The fear there was that if a business wanted to place an order, wanted to communicate with a business partner, the message, if it went through telegraph or if it was read to somebody over a telephone, it was just too easy to eavesdrop. You had too many telephone operators that could listen to phone calls. You had too many telegraph operators that could listen in. So this type of encryption was really designed for business uses. Well, in the early 30s, as the Nazis came to power, they needed to have some mechanism for encrypting what they were wanting to do on the battlefield. And the Enigma machine was the obvious choice. They're made there in Germany. So they nationalized the company, forbade them from making any further machines for private industry or for any other sales, and then added some modifications to it. Now, collecting these things is interesting. There's probably 40,000 or so Enigma machines that were made during World War II by the Nazis. For those of us that collect them, we've identified less than 400 that actually exist. So, yeah, we're talking 1% roughly that have survived.
Wow! So I'm lucky to know two people that actually own one. Ed Scotus being the other.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So, but I own two of them.
Oh, wow!
So, yep. And Ed's machine and my machine, we've had them both side by side at SANS conferences, which is kind of fun to do that. But collecting them is an interesting hobby. It's an expensive hobby, as you can imagine.
Yep. Especially
but you don't have
400.
You don't have to start with an Enigma. Right now on eBay, if I was to go and look, I can find other machines. I'm not saying start with eBay because you can't always trust everything on eBay.
Sure.
But the Swiss, for example, they had a version of the Enigma that was made by the Germans, used in Switzerland during World War II, and the Swiss mathematicians did not trust the version of the Enigma that they were making for the Swiss, so they started working on their own machine. The problem was it took them forever, and they didn't finish it until after World War II. So about 1945, 46 was when the Swiss had their machine ready. But they went ahead and built several hundred of them, and they used a couple of hundred for training. They used a couple of hundred of them out in all the embassies, and a couple of hundred more for wartime reserve. Well, those machines were in use until the early 90s.
Oh, wow.
So they got about 50 years worth of use, and then the Swiss at that point converted all over to computers and got rid of the old typewriter style. Well, they just sold them off to surplus, and you could literally buy one of these Swiss encryption devices for $50, $60 back in the early 90s. Today, you can find them for a few thousand. I mean, they're not terribly expensive. They work just like...
Try again. eBay for the Swiss NEMA 45, the one you're talking about, $18,000 on eBay.
That is a very high price. I can show you others that you can buy for $4,000 or $5,000. In fact, look at, if you get a chance on eBay, go into the history, where things have been sold, and you'll see that 18,000. I don't think he's going to sell it.
Current asking price, 18,000.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Or he's going to sell it to somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. And so encryption device collecting is like collecting art. You can get stung pretty bad. Somebody may actually write a check for $18,000 thinking they found this rare device, only to find out 2 weeks later I could have bought it for $5,000 or $6,000.
It's like
somebody else.
It's like collecting rare Japanese swords, buying stuff off of eBay. You got to be really careful.
You really need to know what you're doing.
Yep.
With Enigmas, they're kind of hard to find now. Once the Imitation Game movie came out, their value just went way up because everybody wanted to own one. And unfortunately, the few that you can find for sale are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Oh my God!
Yeah, so they're almost impossible unless you win the lottery or you're a well-funded startup and you want to spend some of your startup cash on an Enigma machine.
You want to have an Enigma machine in your lobby of your startup or whatever, right?
Yeah, and believe me, there are a few that do that. Because their founder may be uber wealthy and he's using some of his money to create the startup, and so he's he just came out of an exit, so he's sitting on top of a lot of cash. So they go buy an Enigma to put in their lobby. But that being said, I mentioned earlier I have two. The second one was dug up about 5 or 6 years ago in eastern France. So a large number of Enigmas, the reason there's so few that survived was most were destroyed. Destroyed by the Germans as they were retreating.
Yeah, they were ordered to be destroyed, weren't they?
Exactly. Yeah, and in many cases what they did is they either shot it, hit it with a rifle butt, did anything to mechanically render it disabled, and then throw it in a hole and bury it, throw it down a latrine, whatever you could do to throw it in the lake, anything so that the Allies couldn't recover it. Well, these things do get dug up from time to time. In fact, a couple of years ago, 2 really nice ones were recovered out of the North Sea. Some divers found them, brought them up there. They can't be restored. If they've been underwater for 80 years or buried in a hole for 80 years, it's kind of hard to restore them. But you can still, clean them up as best you can. So the one I have is the second one I have is an example like that. And I'll tell you right up front, it cost me a few thousand euros. That was it. Nothing like the hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's because it was dug up by a guy he didn't want it, and he sold it at a flea market. And a friend of mine in France called me and said, "Hey, this is at the flea market. Do you want it?" I said, "Sure."
Oh yeah.
Take PayPal, Venmo,
wire transfer. Yeah, exactly. Wire transfer.
Yeah. Now, the one that came out of the ocean, is that not working? I'm assuming.
That's correct. Yeah.
Gotcha.
I mean, you can get all the crud off of it, but it mechanically will never survive. Now, if you're in North Carolina, you can go see a couple of these. There's a lot of German subs that were sunk off the east coast of the United States. They call it the graveyard of the Atlantic. Mm-hmm. And those subs all contain 2 Enigma machines. Mm-hmm. So there's a U-boat that was, people have been diving it for a number of years. There's a book out called Shadow of the Sea. It's a fun read. And it's written by the divers who went down and actually dove this old German U-boat. So for a number of years, the agreement was you could dive it, you could take pictures of it, but don't go inside. Mm-hmm. And here's an interesting little factoid, is that if a German U-boat surrendered to the Allies, it becomes the property of whoever they surrendered to. So if they surrendered to the British or to us or whatever, it becomes our property. But if we sunk it, in other words, it didn't surrender, it still belongs to Germany. So the U-boats that were sunk off the North Carolina coast, if they didn't surrender, they're still German property, including one particular one, U-571, that is still German property. The sailors that were in there, it's a graveyard. Their bones are still inside. There's still Germans there. The divers at one point decided they popped the hatches and they went in anyway. Of course, the thing is filled with sand, so it took a lot of work to get the sand out, but what they were going after was the Enigmas. And you can see it in the book, The Salvage and Recovery Operations, where they went and they pulled out 2 Enigma machines. Those today sit at the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum in Cape Hatteras. So if you're ever down at Cape Hatteras, go check it out. You can see what a couple of old Enigma machines look like that were sitting under salt water for a lot of years.
Yeah, one of the last ones I remember seeing that was recovered, and it was on the internet, of course, and I don't remember how long ago, but it was one they had found in the bottom of a lake and looked like it had been smashed with the butt of a rifle and then tossed in the lake, and was pretty darn rough.
This one that I have, it's got a very clear bullet hole in it. You can see where they shot it with a Mauser. The plug board on the front is all broken up where they kicked it, and the real clear rifle butt imprint across the top. Yeah, they did everything by the book in order to dispose of that machine before they threw it down into some hole somewhere. So another fun story, these things do turn up in attics. People will be cleaning out their old barn. They might find 2 or 3 of them that were left behind. About 4 or 5 years ago, a, quote, old German typewriter turned up in a flea market in Budapest. And there was a British professor on holiday, as they would say, taking vacation with his family, just happened to be totaling through the flea market, sees the old German typewriter, and knew exactly what that was, and happily paid 100 euros for the old German typewriter.
Got lucky. Talk about luck.
And then sold it to an auction house for $50,000-$60,000, and it wound up in New Orleans. Last time I saw it, it was at Rao Antiques in New Orleans, and I think they had it listed for $350,000 roughly. So you never know. It's almost like picking. These guys on TV go through an American Pickers. Nothing wrong with that. And you can find some of the craziest stuff, particularly if you have access in Europe, where you can go through, the former Eastern Bloc countries and, look for these things. Some have turned up in Spain. There were some Hebrew enigmas that have turned up in Israel.
Huh.
There were a number that have turned up in Norway. They found a number of them in Brazil. So they weren't just in Germany. That's what I'm getting at. So don't leave any stones unturned. And if you're an antiquer, watch around through the antique shops and look for old German typewriters. You never know, you might actually find one. And the Germans did have other things besides Enigmas. There were other types of mechanical devices, but the Enigmas certainly, by far the most popular.
Sure.
And so there are other things to collect. In my collection, I've got U.S. devices. So there was a little machine that was used through the Vietnam War. That those are very easy to find. Little kind of fits on your knee type of device. So they were made here in America, but it was a patent that was owned by a Swedish company that later became a Swiss company. There were devices made through the Cold War, so into the 50s and 60s before computers came of age. And in fact, there's a company that went out of business last year in Switzerland, the Hagelin company. And the Hagelin Corporation had been making essentially machines that competed with the Enigma, also mechanical machines. And they were really, really good at it. And the Enigma uses, it's electro-mechanical. So you have a battery, wires, light bulbs. You can press a key, a light bulb lights up. That is your cipher text letter. But another way of doing this is what they call pin and lug. So when you line up a letter that you want to encipher, rotate the little knob on the side, and a set of pins and lugs will line up a certain letter, which types it onto a piece of paper. And you do this one letter at a time. And so as you go through the message, what comes out, of course, is ciphertext. Well, these are all based on mathematical formulas, prime numbers, ways that make it hard to go in reverse. A good cryptographic algorithm only has a one-way function, and there's really no way to go backwards unless you have the key to go backwards. So mechanical devices can do that, and the Hagelin Corporation had created a number of them that were pretty good. Well, in the early 50s, they came out with one that was really good. I mean, so good that the NSA here was unable to do what they call solve it. So it was unsolvable, meaning they couldn't crack it. And this bothered the NSA. And there's been a few magazine articles and newspaper stories that have come out over the past few years, but from best we can figure out, there was an arrangement, a gentleman's agreement made between the NSA, the German intelligence services, and the Hagelin Corporation to create devices that if they went to a NATO country, they could be unsolvable. If it went to a non-NATO country, it had to look and act and feel just like the hard ones, but it had to be solvable.
We reported on the story about 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago. Because it was a big deal.
It literally had if you want to think of it as a mechanical back door built into it. Mm-hmm. That's not a true backdoor like you would think, cryptographic in terms of math, but they weakened the system so it became solvable. And these were sold to the Egyptians, to other nations, non-NATO, and allowed U.S. and Western forces to continue to monitor it. And this continued up to just a few years ago when they were outed. That company's out of business now.
Yep.
And it's an interesting tale. I hope someday that Hollywood makes a movie of it. This is a great Cold War spy thriller. There's, Hollywood, like they do with The Imitation Game, they'll add their own subplots into it. But the general story is absolutely fascinating, and particularly how long we kept that secret. Because, secrets aren't kept very well. And that's one of few that were kept very, very well. So it's another fun thing of collecting these devices is to learn these stories, learn the histories, the deals that have gone on behind us. And then you can apply it looking forward. What about today's devices? The encryption that's built into your iPhones, your Androids, the encryption that's going on, over Zoom and over Teams. Are they breakable? Are they solvable? Are we trusting these things to be highly secure, or are there hitches and glitches that we're not aware of? And the mature person would say absolutely. It's there. You can't just go in with blinders on. But it doesn't. It also means you don't use the products. You use them, with your eyes wide open. And of course, our adversaries have changed. We're not up against the Nazis anymore. We're up against some very worthy adversaries, namely China and Russia and others. So we have to be aware of that we, the United States, Western allies, we are no longer the king of the hill. There are other adversaries that are as good as this game as we are, and maybe in some cases even better at it than we are. That goes all the way back to what I was talking about earlier. We need more people. We need more folks that are in this game that understand the defensive side, understand how to protect ourselves, understand the threats, where we're going, the long history that's gotten us here, and can continue to help us going forward. So I will always make that appeal. We need those bright minds. They need to come into this career field and help protect everybody else.
I agree, Marcus. And you remind me of a story of, was it Trick with Team Poison? And there was a lot of folks that were advocating when Anonymous was at its peak of popularity and just after, like, this could end badly if folks like this that have these loosely formed groups that are skilled to varying degrees in hacking, as it were, if they were to defect to terrorist groups, this could be a problem. And I mean, unfortunately, that came true. And the whole story is really interesting as all these details came to light. And it turns out Trick and his wife and the son were all killed in drone strikes. Which, I mean, that whole story is just amazing to read.
Right. And that, again, is probably a story that right now we're aware of it, but do future generations, are they taught that lesson? They're aware of what's going on. I mean, we're so filled with all these vignettes and stories and things that have happened that most people have never heard of, unless you just happen to read the article.
Right.
Or, Wired magazine might dig something up and do a good story about it. But there's so much that just is untold, buried, and hidden that we'd love to hear.
Larry, had a couple questions.
These are the stories that, when my dad goes, "So what's interesting in your world?" I go, you really don't want to know.
No.
So, Mark, I got two questions for you. The first one being, bringing us sort of back full circle to Code Girls and the collecting of physical crypto systems. What's some of the availability like of some of the systems that were used for the Japanese side that they may have used, like Purple and a few others?
Yeah, those are real unicorns there. The very few that exist are in museums. NSA has a few of them. The Purple system, believe it or not, was based on a telephone switching device, a PBX, using stepper switches.
Oh, wow.
They just modified it. And Purple it's a whole nother interesting story. So with Enigma, we actually captured several Enigma machines. And like I mentioned, the forerunners were out there, so people understood how Enigma worked. When Purple came along, when the Japanese started encrypting, we didn't understand what was going on. We couldn't make any sense out of what was happening, and we didn't have a device to look at. And some very smart minds asking the right questions were able to reverse engineer essentially the Purple machine and built a near exact copy of it, just kind of by guessing and inferring how such a machine should work. So after the war, when they actually got their hands on some real Purples and compared it to this machine, this prototype we had built that could act like one, it was almost a perfect match.
Oh,
absolutely amazing.
I didn't know that. I remember the purple machine from the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And but its heart, what was behind it was the old stepper switches that were used for rotary dial telephones, which were coming of age in World War II.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
That's the mechanical device that was behind making it work. And so we had that. We just didn't know how they had it hooked up. So again, lots of really cool stories if you've got the time to go and dig and read and ask questions and find out about it. But these the Japanese device is extremely hard to find. Other ones that are hard to find would be the high level things that NSA and others were using for strategic communications, SIG-ABA and Type-X and some machines that only a few were built, very few survived. The rarest of all is the big old bombs, the OMBE, that we were using to crack the Enigmas.
Yeah.
None of them survived. They were all dismantled, thrown away after the war. Colossus.
They rebuilt one, though.
That's right. I mean, they have built, working prototypes, models, but I'm talking about the real McCoy.
I thought they had a real McCoy at the Cryptological Museum.
Crypto Museum. That's a copy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And go look up Colossus. There was one wheel, an aluminum wheel, left from the original Colossus that didn't go to the scrapyard. And other than that, they have rebuilt. They had a Colossus project a number of years ago in the UK to rebuild the machine. So they have a working prototype. Looks, acts, functions just like the original, but is not the original machine.
Interesting.
It's a rebuild. So that's extremely rare, to find those things. I was fortunate, NSA, in some of the machines, the rotor-based machines we were building, we were very careful about making sure they got destroyed. But sometimes the rotors, the actual little round thing that rotates, it's got the pins on it, they would take all the wiring out and then they'd use them as going away presents for people. So I've got one of these. There's a few of them out there. If you're a really good hunter, you can find bits and pieces of machines that only exist in museums. You just kind of have to be real careful about where you go look for them, looking in unexpected places, and be able to identify them. So if you're looking at something that's got numbers around the outside, little pins, and doesn't make any sense, you might very well be looking at a piece of an old mechanical cipher device. And for $5 at the local antique store, so
right,
you quickly buy it, just like you would an old German typewriter, and you sneak out of there before anybody knows what you found.
Marcus, do you have a talk on cipher machines, like the history of cipher machines, or how to acquire cipher machines?
I do. So I did a talk at RSA a number of years ago on what we were mentioning earlier with the Hagelin Corporation, and this was based on. There was a Freedom of Information Act set of documents that NSA released back around 2015 or so. Unfortunately, they did not do a good job of redacting those documents. And that's where we began to piece together this long believed story that there had been a backdoor in these devices. And the evidence of that was in these unredacted documents that were accidentally released. Well, so I did a talk on that at RSA. Right after I did that talk, and I didn't realize this was going on, another set of reporters had also kind of sniffed that there was a problem. They began doing their investigative reporting, and they published in the Washington Post and in a German newspaper, Die Zeitung, or one of those, a much deeper expose. And even since then, more has come out. So that talk's out there. If you go to the RSA archives, you can see that one. But I've got a kind of a general history talk that I give. I've done it at B-Sides here in Huntsville. I've given it to different ISSA and ISC squared groups. And when I do that, it's essentially probably 90% Enigma, 10% all the other stuff, because you need to understand there's more to this than just Enigmas. But when I do those, I'll bring some of the collection with me. So the Enigma that works, of course, I'll bring that along so people can see it. Also a Fialka, which is a Soviet Union machine. It's electric, so it's not battery operated by the Enigma. You actually have to plug it in to make it work. The Soviet, actually, I have two of those. The Russians consider them to be controlled cryptographic items. They don't want anybody owning them, but there's nothing they can do about it because they literally escaped when the Soviet Union imploded in the early 90s. The ones that were in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, they all quickly found their way out of Europe in the collector's hands. And the Russians, of course, don't like that one a little bit because these are pretty good machines.
Yeah.
But those I'll bring. Some other little hand-operated devices, little wheels and gizmos. I've got some things from the early 20s that came out of France that were used by businesses. So it's a fun talk to give, and it's something particularly for minds that want to see them, where they want to play with them. Because if you go to a museum, they're sitting under glass.
You can't touch it. Right.
And one thing about these mechanical devices, if it's sitting under glass, it's not doing the mechanical device any good. They need to be operated. The keys need to be pressed. The wheels need to be rotated. Otherwise, the oil in there dries up. The grease dries up. You got to keep them lubricated and running. The springs will break. So it's like a car. If you're into car collecting, you don't want that car just sitting in the garage admiring. You want to turn it on and drive it around a little bit, just get the oil warm They last a lot longer. So mechanical devices, same way. You gotta run them in order to preserve them.
Speaking of running them to preserve them, what's sort of next on your list of either system or component that you're sort of hunting down for that you do, that you don't want to, one that it's okay?
I'd say it's another unicorn, but there are a few out there. There were some typewriters that were made for the Americans to take a shot at translating the German or the Japanese stuff.
Yes, I've heard about these. Might have been
encrypted by Purple or not, right? So if you think about the Japanese language, we've got lots and lots and lots of pen strokes that make up a character or a word. Yep. But when you're talking a typewriter, it's a discrete number of keys. And if you want to put it out over Morse code, there's kind of a finite number of Morse code characters you can use. So the Japanese developed a shortcut, and they came up with a way of encoding Japanese using Morse code so that you could literally type it into a machine and send it out teletype style. So some typewriters were built that kind of reverse that process. If you type in the American letter or the English letter that sounds like the Morse code, like if it's a dit, that would be E in English, or a dash would be T in English. So you type that in. What hits the paper is the Japanese equivalent. Oh. So you're literally typing it in English and it's coming out in Japanese. That's what I'm looking for. One of those.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember reading some story about like the Japanese typewriter that was Japanese characters, and it was something ridiculous. Like it had like 300 and something keys on it, but they were a little different.
Right. Wait a minute. There's 3 Japanese alphabets. There's hiragana, katakana, and kanji. And so there's Japanese kanji is the ideograms. The single character means a word or a concept or an idea. And there are typewriters that'll do that, but they're, oh my God, weird. Yeah, they have a ball above the paper, and you move the striking piece above the paper, and you select the striking piece, and then you smack it. And so it puts the line, the stroke in place. It's crazy, but the hiragana or katakana are just like American alphabets or Romaji alphabets in that they have a phonetic alphabet. So a specific character has a specific sound.
This one is in kana. It's katakana is the specific one I'm looking for. And the reason I'm looking for it is back at Bletchley Park, which is where the British were doing their code cracking. Somebody there by hand created little index cards with every kind of word, the symbol, phrase they could come up with, translated into English, and all the possible other meanings that it could have. And it's in a card deck sitting in a museum there at Bletchley, if you're ever there to go look at it. Well, in collecting, I came across 3 of these cards. It somehow escaped from Bletchley. They're sitting here in my collection. So I'm trying to find the typewriter that goes along with those cards. Again, it's like hunting a unicorn. But it's still something fun to look for. There's another little thing called a Kira. It's a handheld, looks like a stopwatch. And there are a few of those around. They're hard to find, but if you can find one, they're kind of fun to collect as well. So, there's some of those things that are on my short list. I don't think I'll ever find them, but you never know. You always just keep your eyes open. But a lot of us also collect things that are not directly cipher machine related, but all the peripheral things that go around it could be code books, things like the German Order of Battle. This was something that the Allies had put together in 1942, 43, 44 that gives you all the names and numbers, who the commanders were. So if you find an encryption device, you can figure out what unit was in. You can look it up in the German Order of Battle and determine exactly who was using it. That's kind of fun. You put a face to a name. Or I've got a German set of identification papers to an Enigma operator. So he was a young corporal in the Nazi army, and his job was an encryption machine operator. It says that in his identity papers. So, little things like that are fun to collect because it's also part of the hobby. It's not just World War II, but it's across the board. I've got things from the Vietnam era, from the Korean War. Don't have anything from the Civil War. That'd be kind of fun, but those are extremely rare. If you could find any Civil War artifacts. But again, it's a fascinating hobby, but watch your wallet. My goodness, you could spend your entire retirement on these things. On the other hand, they make a great investment.
Some people collect wine, cigars, all kinds of stuff. You collect cipher machines. It's awesome, Marcus. Yeah. I want to thank you for coming on Paul Security Weekly this evening. It was awesome having you on, man.
Yeah, this is a lot of fun, and I'm surprised we took forever for us to do this. So,
I know.
Let's don't wait another 20 years, right?
We'll have to have you back. Thanks so much. With that, we'll take a short break and come back with the security news. Stay tuned.